We'll start with exercise 1, print even numbers. Write a C program that uses a for loop to print all even numbers between a given range. I think this sort of means within a given range, inclusive. I'm going to interpret this to mean that if you give a range like 2 through 8, it prints out 2, 4, 6, 8. So everything starting at the first position and ending and including this last one and all of the even numbers between them. Now, the way the exercise is phrased, and keep in mind, of course, that ChatGPT doesn't know exactly what we've covered in this course so far, there actually are a few different branches we could take to make this work. I'm going to start with a version that I think is pretty appropriate to sort of midweek in the week that we cover loops. And there are a couple of ones that require a little bit of material that are more adaptive, that require some material that we haven't seen yet. Okay, so we'll go over here, and then we'll paste this in as our exercise. There we go. So write a C program that uses a for loop to print all numbers, I'm going to say within a given range. Because this exercise says you have to use a for loop, obviously you have to use a for loop. As I've mentioned before, it's a great exercise just to practice loops, to take any code you've written with a for loop and convert it to use a while loop instead. But of course, the purpose of this series is I'm going to respect the exercises that I'm given to the extent that I can. Okay, so I have to define a range of numbers. In this case, it doesn't say specifically whether I'm supposed to use real numbers or integers, but I interpret this to be referring to integers. And the reason is because this word here doesn't make sense for arbitrary real numbers. It makes sense to talk about whether the integer 3 is odd or even, or whether the integer 6 is odd or even. But I don't know what it means to say that this number is odd or even. And if you're wondering about that, like you might say, well, wait, it ends in a 5. Doesn't that make it odd? But does it end in a 5? I mean, really, 3.5 is equal to 3.50, so it ends in a 0. I mean, I can add as many zeros on there as I want. Maybe you can see the problem here. I don't want to talk about even or odd numbers unless I'm talking about whole numbers, integers. So because I read it that way, because the word even to me sounds like something involving integers, I'm going to use integers for everything in this program. A second hint to me that I should use integers here is that generally speaking, if we're counting stuff off in loops, we should use int as our loop counter type. Okay, so that's another thing. There are reasons you might use double or float though. So in this case, the fact that I'm talking about even numbers, that's why I think about this as an integer exercise. So range start. Okay, I'm going to begin by printing all even numbers from, let's say, 2 up to 10. Range end. So I start at 2, I go up to 10. And I'm just going to count through those using a loop. And there are a few ways we could engineer this. So I'm going to try and approach this just like I think many of you are going to do during this week, which is we're going to try and write our loops with like creating them without the loop itself, getting to the point where we copy and paste code, and then turning it into a loop. So we get our 3 ingredients, and then we condense that down into a loop. Okay, so I'll make a variable to store my current value, and I'll start that off at range start. Okay, and then at each step, I'll print out the current value. I'm going to print it off followed by a space. And the idea is, I guess, I want my output to look sort of like this. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And that's all in one line. So I'm going to print each value off followed by a space. All right. And then, okay, so I guess maybe what I could do is I'll print off a new line here. I just want to make sure my code works at all right now. It's good to compile and run as often as we possibly can. Now, that warning we can, of course, ignore because it's just a variable I haven't had a chance to use yet. Okay, it prints out the value 2. And I think, okay, so currently I'm working with the number 2. What is the next even number after 2? Well, it's 4, okay. But in general, if I'm working with an even number, what is the next even number after it? Well, it's the one that's 2 away. So if I add 2 to my value, I'll get the next even number. So current value equals current value plus 2. And then I'll print this off again. Okay, so now it's prints 2 and 4. And here it looks like what I could do, and actually I'm going to adjust the spacing a little bit here. It looks like what I could do here is just copy and paste this line to print out as many even numbers in a row as I want. And this is the methodology we've already used in this course. I just get to the point where I can literally copy and paste the same code. Once I have that, once I've got this copied and pasted code, usually it's possible to look at it and decide what my 3 ingredients are. So one thing I observe is I want to stop after my current value, and just for the sake of the example, let's paste it a bunch of times. I want to stop once my current value hits the end of the range. Notice how I copied and pasted it so many times that I'm going past the end of the range. So that's going to be one of my ingredients to know when to stop. I think I want to stop when my current value is greater than the end of the range. Or in other words, I want to continue as long as my current value is less than or equal to the end of the range. And I think I have enough to synthesize my 3 ingredients. Now I'm writing a for loop, so I have to put all 3 ingredients in the loop statement, so right up here. For current value equals range start, current value is less than or equal to range end. That's my continuation condition. And then finally, at each step, the way I modify current value is by adding 2. So I could write current value equals current value plus 2. And then the contents of my loop, the body of my loop here, is just going to be the print statement. Everything else is getting handled by these 3 ingredients. I've got my initialization, I've got my continuation condition, and I've got my incrementation. Okay, so we'll indent this a little bit, and then I'm going to go down and wipe this all out. There we go. And once I'm done my loop, I'm going to print out my new line. All right, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So it looks like the code is working, but that doesn't mean it is. I have to make sure I test it first. And we have to begin to wonder now, exactly what inputs could this program expect to take? So I guess one thing I should test is, what if I give it any other range besides 2 and 10? So why don't we do 6 and let's do 18. All right, looks like that works. Let's try giving it a really large range, so 6 all the way through 50. That works too. Just scanning through it, it looks like it's checking out, and it goes up to and includes 50. That's important because it does say it says inclusive, and that means we should include both endpoints in the result. And then I also want to test about a few peculiar cases. So what if you decide to plug in a range that only has one thing in it? Well, that still should print out the number 6 because it prints out the start and end of the range. So we'll try that out. Okay, it does just print out the number 6. Okay, now what if I do weird things? So what if I give ranges that don't make any sense or make less sense than usual? What if I try and print a range starting with 10 and ending with 6? Well, it doesn't make any sense to ask what even numbers are greater than or equal to 10 and less than or equal to 6. And so, in my opinion, this range should result in nothing being printed. And okay, sure enough, it doesn't. So as far as I'm concerned, that works correctly. You could also make the argument, if the exercise were just this, you could also make the argument that this is none of your business. That if somebody does this, it's their problem, whatever comes out, because you weren't given instructions for what to do. If this were an exam question, you would be given instructions. You might be told, don't worry about ranges like this. Or you might be told, if the range has this problem, then it should print nothing. So in general, of course, exam questions tend to be a lot more formal. What about a few other examples? So all even numbers in a range. Well, that could include even, like 0 is an even number. So I should be able to print out ranges beginning with 0. Looks like that works. And you know what? To be honest, so is like -10. Negative numbers can still be odd or even, so I should make sure I test it. If I don't test it, I have no idea whether it will actually work. Okay, so -10, 8, 6, 4, -2, 0, 2, 4, 6, that looks good. What if I work with negative numbers that are both the start and end point of the range? So every even number starting at -10 and working its way up to -2. Okay, that also works. Okay, so I think at this point the exercise is correct. And as far as the exercise is written for this week's material, we're now done. Because I've tested it, I verified that it does work on large ranges, small ranges, ranges that are inverted, so cases where the start is greater than the end, and on cases where I have negative numbers, both crossing over from negative to positive and working strictly inside of negatives. The exercise is done. Now you can stop the video. Unless you're thinking about a case like this. So what if I do something like this? Now my range start isn't an even number. For what we know this week, it might not be possible to solve this problem, but since it is something that might be in your head, I do want to point out a couple of options we have to solve it. Okay, so if I run this, it doesn't work because it's supposed to print even numbers, and none of these things are even numbers. You could argue that that's the user's fault because they shouldn't have plugged in odd numbers. And for this week's material, I'd say that's a good argument. But it doesn't say that in the prompt. In the exercise, it literally just says, in a given range, with no requirements that the range consist only of even numbers, within a given range, print all the even numbers. So you could look at this and say, it does seem like the user should be allowed to do this. How do we work around this problem? This type of question could show up on the midterm, but in week 2, we haven't gotten to the solution to it yet. But here is the solution that I might try and use. There are a variety of ways of doing this, but what I would need is the ability to ask the question, is this an odd number? Because if it's an odd number, I don't want to start printing there. In my opinion, if you give me the range 3 through 11 and you want me to do this, I guess I'm supposed to print 4, 6, 8, 10. So, in other words, I start at the first even number greater than or equal to the start of the range. So what I could do to fix this is, if I detect that the range start is odd, I just add 1 to it. So in other words, if I notice 3 is an odd number, that means the real range start should be 4. So that's the way I'm going to choose to solve this problem. So I need the ability to ask the question, is the range start an odd number? Now I need a particular feature of the language that we're going to bring up in, I think, week 3, which is this, the modulo operator. So you'll learn about this in week 3 if you're watching this video before week 3, but this expression here returns the remainder after I divide range start by 2. So of course, 3 divided by 2 is going to be, that's going to be 1.5, but the remainder is, if I use integer division, the remainder is 1. And so if the remainder after division by 2 comes out to be 1, then I'm working with an odd number. So what this if statement is really asking is the range start odd? So in this case, range start is odd. Okay, so my way of solving the problem is just to add 1 to range start. If range start is an odd number, range start equals range start plus 1. I just add 1 to it, and I boost it up a bit. And I want to show off something interesting, which is, you'll notice at the moment, I'm not going to worry about range end. I'm just going to run this and see what happens. And it turns out that it works. And if you trace this code, once you know what this stuff does, if you trace this code, you might discover that actually I don't have to accommodate range end. It's fine just the way it is. If it's odd, everything's still going to work. I just have to make sure that range start starts off at an even number. So here, I have now modified the program to work even if the range is specified in terms of odd numbers, but I just adjust the range if that turns out to be the case. Okay, so there is the absolute solution to the problem, not just the solution for week number 2. So I think we're ready to move on to exercise 2.